Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to a conversation with the National Cancer Institute's Director, Dr. Ned Sharpless, about plans for the current fiscal year. We are streaming live via both Facebook and Twitter. For those who may not be familiar, the National Cancer Institute, NCI, is one of the 27 institutes and centers that comprise the National Institutes of Health, the nation's medical research agency. In a moment, I will turn it over to Dr. Sharpless, but first, some business. We are aiming to spend about half of our time together today addressing questions from folks participating online, so please feel free to submit your questions in the comment section. Please note that we will be unable to answer questions specific to cancer diagnosis during today's discussion. If you or a loved one are currently facing cancer, we encourage you to reach out to NCI's Contact Center at 1-800-4-CANCER or visit cancer.gov for helpful resources. Please also note that NCI reserves the right to remove comments that are inconsistent with our social media policies at our complete discretion. Now I'll turn things over to NCI Director, Dr. Ned Sharpless.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to all of you watching and joining today. I've been NCI Director since October of 2017, and before that I directed the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of North Carolina. And for my entire career, I've been a clinical oncologist treating patients and a lab researcher working on cancer genetics. One thing that I've appreciated since entering federal service is that given the NCI's role as the world's largest funder of cancer research, I think it's really important that we communicate how we are using taxpayer dollars to address our mission of reducing the burden of cancer suffering for all Americans. Therefore, I've been working hard to communicate in this new role, and I've been doing it a bunch of ways. I've done personal trips to academic centers and cancer centers. I've been speaking at national meetings. I've had many conversations with traditional journalists in the media through the NCI websites and my blog and the lively Twitter feed. And today we're trying a new format with a live social media interview in the hopes of bringing news from the NCI to you directly and in a way where we can answer your questions from you directly. To help with that, I'm pleased to be joined today by two esteemed colleagues, Dr. Elizabeth Jaffe and Dr. Daphna Barsagi. In addition to being accomplished cancer researchers and scientists and leaders in the field, Liz and Daphna chair two of the most important advisory boards to the NCI. Liz chairs the National Cancer Advisory Board, and Daphna chairs the Board of Scientific Advisors. These large boards give the NCI critical advice on the NCI mission, and they're really important. Parenthetically, I'm told this is the first time that the chairs of both boards of the main NCI advisory boards are women, which I think is really a sign of the times. There's so many great female cancer researchers today that it's only natural that we have them leading our boards at present. So Liz and Daphna, would you please introduce yourselves?
Yes, thanks, Ned. Hello, everyone. I am the Deputy Director of the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center at Johns Hopkins. I'm also the co-director of the Gastrointestinal Cancer Program and Associate Director of the Bloomberg Kimmel Institute for Cancer Immunology. My research expertise is actually cancer immunology and pancreatic cancer. I focus on the development of immunotherapies for pancreatic cancer. And currently, I also serve as the president of the American Association for Cancer Research.
Hello, everyone. I am the Senior Vice President and the Vice Dean for Science and Chief Scientific Officer at NYU Langone Health. I'm also a cancer researcher. My work focuses on oncogenic signaling in cancer development and progression. I'm particularly interested in pancreatic cancer and a particular oncogene that is at work in this cancer, the RAS oncogene. And I have been serving on NCI's committees for many years and a real supporter of the NCI mission to support research of cancer researchers around the country.
Yeah, thanks both of you. As mentioned, I'll make a few opening remarks and then we'll have a couple of conversation among the three of us, and then we'll open the lines up for questions, so to speak. And I should also say the NCI is a vast organization and full of interesting business, and there's certainly a lot of interesting things going on in Washington today. But I think given our limited time, I'd like to focus on an area of great importance to cancer scientists as well as cancer advocates, doctors, and patients, and that's the NCI budget. There'll be another time to talk about some of these other issues, but today we're going to focus on the budget. So since starting at the National Cancer Institute, I find myself repeating a statement over and over again that it's a special time in cancer research. We're making progress in in cancer at a breathtaking pace, faster than we have at any time in my career. And there's several ways to illustrate this. We have better outcomes, better survival from cancer in national statistics. We're curing patients with types of cancer that we used to never cure before. We have really new ideas in cancer detection, prevention, and therapy that are making it into the clinic. And this is translating into a record number of FDA approvals for cancer drugs, for example, last year. And then lastly, we're getting broad bipartisan support for cancer research from the Congress. We have a significant increase in our funding for 5 years in a row now. At the same time, despite this great progress, we have to acknowledge there's still a long way to go. We have too many people in the United States dying of cancer. Some of this progress is uneven. We're making a lot of progress in some types of cancer, but there are other types of cancer where we've seen little improvement, and survival is still pretty grim for some types of cancer. And then there's survivorship challenges. For example, in childhood cancer, we're able to cure a lot of kids with cancer, but then the toxicity of the cure, the long-term survivorship issues related to the therapy, caused lifelong side effects. So we still have work to do, and that we need to continue to improve our understanding of cancer and continue to generate new ideas for diagnosis, prevention, and treatment. And we need to continue to attract the best and the brightest to our research fields. This continued desperate need for progress is my principal concern as director of the National Cancer Institute. We're committed to using all our resources, not just our budget, but the federal convening power and our leadership that we have to stay ahead of the curve and ensure a healthy cancer research enterprise in the years ahead. This tremendous excitement in cancer research has had an unexpected effect, of which many in the extramural community are not yet aware. And that's that at the National Cancer Institute, over the last 5 years, we're seeing a striking increase in the number of new grant applications. Fueled by recent advances, congressional support, and more recently enthusiasm generated by the Cancer Moonshot, grant applications to the NCI are up sharply. For example, applications for the R01 grant, which is a workhorse grant that funds independent scientists, are up nearly 50% since 2013. This is by far the largest increase in this type of application seen to any part of the National Institutes of Health, and I would argue is a sign of the vibrancy of our cancer research field. It illustrates that really great scientists are being drawn to cancer research because of our enhanced understanding of the disease. And let me be clear, this large influx of applications is good news for the NCI, as we have more choices to make among these many applications to find the very best science to fund. And funding the best new ideas for cancer research is really good news for patients, as more rapid scientific progress is the means by which we make the most important progress against cancer. But this large influx in applications also causes a problem, and that is a problem for cancer scientists. You see, the more and more applications for funding we receive, the more competitive funding from the NCI has become. One way to measure this is with something called pay lines, which is a rough measure as to how hard it is to get a grant from the NCI. And pay lines are dictated by a math. They're just the number of grants that are funded divided by the number of new applications received. Now, our budget has increased substantially since 2013, like 20%, but our grant applications have increased even faster, like 50% over the same period. So left unchecked, this influx of applications will drive down pay lines, and the NCI pay lines are now lower than I would like. So let me say it again. If you have cancer, or if you love someone who has cancer, what I'm saying is good news. This surfeit of great new science coming to the NCI is a good problem, but it is a problem nonetheless for scientists funded by the NCI. NCI needs to do something about this so we don't turn off scientists and dissuade them from coming to our field. We have to make sure we find the best ideas to do that. We are prioritizing funding to the pool of monies called the RPG pool, or the Research Project Grant Pool. And this is the pool of support that funds extramural investigator-initiated science. And prioritizing the RPG pool requires tough choices at the NCI. That is, despite increased funding from Congress for 5 years in a row, we still have to take dollars from other places in the NCI budget and move these funds to the RPG pool. So we really have our work cut out for us. We are approaching these issues strategically as we can, and I'm eager to talk with you about how that's going. So let's get started. So we'll turn it over for questions for Liz and Daphne.
So Ned, you have mentioned that the goal is to preserve pay lines, and I was just wondering to what extent you're considering shifting or moving money around the NCI in order to preserve the pay lines?
Yeah, thank you. So this, to be clear, the amount of money we spend for cancer research is appropriated by Congress. So our budget is set by the Congress, and we spend the funds that were provided. But we do have flexibility within the NCIs to how we use those funds. And so what I alluded to is that we're moving funds from other areas of the NCI in some cases to prioritize the RPG pool. So how are we doing that? So first off, we applied a 5% across the board cut to what we call the docs, the divisions and centers within the NCI. This cut does not extend to the personnel of the docs, nor the grants that they administer, but of the portion of the doc budget that is not covered in those two bins. Similarly, we are cutting non-competing awards. When you come in to renew your grant every year, in the absence of a competition, that budget will be cut slightly, a 3% cut. And we are cutting the new award, the first year of the funding, more than we have in the past. So usually we've cut that around 17%, and this year we're cutting it 19%. And we're taking those monies from the other areas and moving them into the RPG pool, for example, and other things that we're prioritizing. Lastly, there's some ongoing initiatives that we have slowed. So there were things that we were starting to do, mostly that were growing in size, that we've decided to continue to grow, but more slowly. So an example of this would be the cryo-electron microscopy program at Frederick National Lab. That's a very successful program. It's widely used by the extramural community. We intend to grow it, and we intend to eventually probably double the budget of that facility. But rather than do that in 1 year, we're going to do that over a couple of years. Likewise, we have a lung cancer sequencing project we're going to do more slowly. We have a large mammography screening trial that we're going to grow, but more slowly than we planned. So there are a number of ways that we can save money in the present fiscal year by postponing some of the costs of the out years. So through those measures, by cutting non-competing awards, cutting the new award a little bit, the 5% cut to the docs, and then also slowing some initiatives, we can find considerable funds that we can then use for the RPG pool and to prioritize other things that we consider mission critical.
Ned, can I follow up on that question? So science is becoming very collaborative. So are we going to see you increasing pools for grants that are multi-investigator, SPORE grants, program grants, or will these also slow up?
Right. So many of the multi-investigator grants that we fund are out of the RPG pool. So by putting money into the RPG pool, we will therefore provide funds for multi-investigator grants. Now, there are a few, for example, the SPORE grant mechanism you mentioned, very popular. We won't really cut the number of spores. In fact, the number of spores we hope eventually to perhaps increase in out years, not in 2019. But we will be cutting, like the other grants that are getting renewed, that are getting cut 3%. The spores will also get that same 3% cut. So we're really passing that non-competing renewal cut to the vast majority of grants at the NCI funds. The few exceptions are training grants. We want to continue to focus on training. We're not cutting the cancer center grants for reasons I can discuss if interested. The Moonshot has separate funding, so we're not cutting Moonshot awards. So there are a few things that we're preserving that are mission critical, but for the most part, any non-competing award is going to get cut 3%.
Okay.
And yet another.
Please.
Go ahead, Liz. Just maybe we were thinking about asking the same question, which is there is another very important constituent, which is the early career investigators. Yes. How do you foresee this affecting them?
Yeah,
or
maybe
not?
Daphne, I'd ask you to explain the premise of that question a little better. So you're a dean at a major academic university. I'm sure the care and feeding of the junior faculty is particularly important to you. Do you think why are low pay lines bad from your perspective? Or what's the challenge it imposes on your investigators?
Yes, and thanks for bringing it up, because certainly what I see among our early career investigators, so these are investigators that we have recruited over the last 2 or 3 years. They're contemplating right now applying for the first R1 application. As Ned mentioned, there is a phenomenal talent, young talent, that is going now into cancer research, and they're particularly demoralized and concerned about their ability to secure funding, which is their lifeline after they finish their startup package and they need to start using the grant support in order to support their labs. So it will be very interesting to hear from you, Ned, what the NCI is forecasting relative to this very important population for the pipeline of cancer research.
Yeah,
and also, if you could let everyone know what the NCI has done, because you've done a few important things for these for early career investigators.
Sure. Yeah. So this, by the way, fits with my experience when I was a cancer center director, when I was in academia, that, low pay lines are a problem for everybody getting funding for science.
Yeah.
But the old pros who've written a lot of grants before, pay lines go up and they go down. They're used to that situation. But new investigators are disproportionately disadvantaged by low pay lines. And we actually have data to back this up, that, if we lose investigators at an early stage, they will go to other fields. They will stop being cancer researchers and move into other areas of science. And the last thing we want to do is dissuade anybody from entering cancer research. So we're trying, and by the way, I should also say the U.S. Congress is very interested in this topic. So when they provided funding for the Cancer Moonshot, they asked the NCI to specifically address the issue of early stage investigators, so-called ESIs, early stage investigators. So we've done a number of things to trying to prioritize that pool. First off, we have a separate pay line for them. So anyone who qualifies as an ESI, their chances of getting funding are considerably better than established investigators. So an ESA pay line may differ by as much as 5% between an established investigator and an ESI. So their odds of getting that first grant are higher. Additionally, we have, through that, by giving them a separate pay line, we've dramatically increased in 2018 the number of ESIs we funded. So our goal was to increase the ESI grants by at least 25% in 2018, and we far surpassed that. And I hope we will continue to be able to add to the ESI pool in 2019. And then lastly, we've been testing out a new grant mechanism for the early stage investigators at the NCI, which is a 7-year grant. We think that these faculty that are before they're tenured are at a particular risk for the stuff that comes up in life, and therefore a longer award is particularly beneficial. So this is our 37 grant that some people are getting, that is a 5-year grant with the option to extend it for 2 years with minimal extra paperwork. And we're doing that in such a way that we'll see if the people who get the 7-year grant derive some advantage of that compared to the people who get the 5-year grant. So a bunch of things that's going on for early stage career people. Those are just a few to mention.
Right. So I had another question for you. You mentioned how important, progress has been in our field. Can you mention what some of the new initiatives are that you're thinking about funding?
Sure. We have a number of new initiatives that we're allowed, that by moving these funds around, we're allowed to preserve the priorities that we have that I started been talking about. So, for example, big interest in immuno-oncology, as you know, and are a leader in that field. But as I look at what's going on nationally, there's sort of two kinds of immuno-oncology. There's these checkpoint inhibitors that are a good fit for pharmaceutical company testing. And then there's cellular immunotherapy that is harder. Right now, it's sort of manufacturing issues and other challenges have made that very difficult. And so as I look at that, I think the NCI needs to fund basic research in both areas, but where we really need to help clinically is in the cellular immunotherapy arena, because that's ability to move forward is limited presently by payer issues and manufacturing issues and FDA requirements. And so the NCI, I think, can play a real role there. Childhood cancer is a priority for us. This is something where we've definitely been interested in, and particularly getting better handle on the data related to childhood cancer, to try and do data aggregation, because most childhood cancers are rare cancers. And so we have to really learn from every child with cancer and make sure we maximally extract benefit from what we're doing in childhood cancer. As I said, we're really prioritizing trainees. I think that arguably the most important thing the National Cancer Institute does is train the next generation of cancer researchers. And so we're really prioritizing that. And then we're very focused on clinical trials. As you know, the clinical trials infrastructure has become clunky, for want of a better word. It's a challenge, and it faces changes in how we're treating cancer and how we're doing clinical trials. And so we're trying to modernize clinical trials. I wrote a piece yesterday, in fact, came out in JAMA with Jim Dorshow on modernizing clinical trials. And I refer people to that if they want to hear the full sketch of plans. And a lot of other stuff, but those are those I mentioned.
Can you also just say what you're doing for health disparities? Because, as the recent report showed, cancer deaths are going down, but not in certain populations of patients with cancer.
Yeah, I can talk about what we're doing, but it might be a good idea if you mention your interest in this topic at AACR and your leadership there. I think AACR has been out in front of cancer disparities. It'd be really nice to talk about.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. We recently had a think tank that was led by a number of leaders in this field, including John Carpton, who is also leading the scientific program this year. And health disparities will be a major topic of our AACR annual meeting. And with this think tank, we've identified a number of areas that we want to use to raise awareness and increase funding. And we certainly love partnering with the NCI, and there was NCI representation at the think tank, and we'll continue to be a part of things as we move forward. And in 2020, we will have at the NCI a annual report that will begin in 2020, raising awareness of progress in health disparities. So there's a lot going on, and I know the NCI is helping with this, and I know it's important. It's an important area for you.
Yeah, I think it's an area where the time has really come to take these things head on, and there is actually, when we do the analysis, there's always already a very large portfolio of NIH grants that have some health disparities focus. And for those of you not familiar with the jargon, by disparities we mean two populations have the same cancer, but one population does worse than the other. And that could be because of race or educational status or living in a rural versus an urban area, or, for a number of other reasons. So why these disparities exist in terms of outcome and incidence, really interesting scientific question that's amenable to study through a variety of means. So these sorts of disparities questions are really permeating throughout the NCI portfolio, and we have a long history of studying those and continue that. And by the way, I think this is a very important focus within the Cancer Moonshot. So, as the Blueprint panel enunciated these 10 areas for focus, and disparities is interwoven across those. I will also mention we have a new funding announcement going right now for the rural-urban disparity. This is a disparity where in the United States in the early 1990s, patients that lived in rural areas did better in terms of outcome than patients that lived in urban areas. That switched in the early 90s, and this disparity gets worse every year since. So now urban patients are doing better than rural patients, and nobody can exactly explain why. This is an interesting scientific question, but also, as you can imagine, of tremendous importance. If we can cure people just in the big cities at the major cancer centers, but we can't disseminate those cures, out into the community, then are we really meeting our job? So, we're very focused on disparities in general, and including that newly appreciated disparity.
So Ned, you mentioned the Moonshot, which was really a phenomenal boost for the cancer research efforts. This will go away at some point in the near future. And can you say a little bit about what you foresee are going to be the measures that we're going to take once this money is going to go away?
Sure. As you know, the Moonshot provided $1.8 billion to the National Cancer Institute from the 21st Century Cures legislation to be dispersed over 7 years. So it was $300 million for the first 2 years, and then $400 million this year, and then it goes to $200 million next year for 4 years, and then the funding ceases. So that's a great vote from Congress, a vote of support for cancer research, and we really appreciate this tremendous support. It does, as you allude, though, create a little bit of a problem because we have a big influx of money in 2019, and then that number goes down $200 million in 2020, and then goes away entirely 3 years after that. So the NCI is going to experience two $200 million cuts, if you will, to our budget over the next couple of years. This is a really good problem to have. I'm not complaining because we have been able to use the Moonshot funding for some great new projects and really accelerate science, particularly translational efforts. But that budgeting structure does provide some challenges, and we have to really think about the out-year costs of these grants and make sure that we are, taking on new initiatives in a way that we can afford responsibly in future years. At some time, all the moonshot funding is going to end. But no doubt, things that we're building with the moonshot today, some of these great immuno-oncology networks and new areas of research, those are going to continue to exist beyond the term of the moonshot. So we'll have to start funding those things with our general appropriation at some point in the future. Luckily, we have a lot of time to plan, and we've been planning the budgeting for the moonshot actively.
Great.
So it looks like, are we moving to questions from the audience now, I think?
Yeah.
Oh, I have a first question. Wow, this is working. The internet, who knew? The question is about clinical trials. So how is the budget affecting big programs like the NCTN and NCORE? So that's a little jargon. The NCTN refers to the National Clinical Trials Network. This is the big NCI-funded network that supports clinical trials, like it used to be called the intergroups, for example. And NCORE is the National Community Oncology Research Program, and that is a sort of about 50 sites in a network that have satellites at 900 sites. So we can enroll patients through the NCTN and NCORE at lots of places in the United States. The sorts of trials that are a good fit for the NCTN versus NCORE are a little different. The community oncology setting lends itself to certain kinds of clinical trials that that may or may not be a good fit for the cancer centers. But those are really important networks whereby we do research. So this is one of the areas where we are prioritizing funding despite the budget situation I mentioned. When I started as NCI director, I believed and have become further convinced that we have under-resourced clinical trials at the NCI. This sort of came about through a complex history I won't go into, but it was obvious when I started that funding for the National Clinical Trials Network, for example, and the NCORE both needed to increase. Last year in 2018, we were able to add significant funding to both programs, or actually to NCTN last year. And then in 2019, I hope we will be able to add significant new funds to both programs. They're really important. We still have a ways to go. I think that we need to continue to support those to catch up with the sort of reimbursement rates for industry-sponsored trials. And that's an area where we will continue to focus to the extent possible in 2020 and beyond. Any comments about the clinical trials networks from you two, Liz and Daphne?
I agree, they're very important.
Yeah, I also agree that, and want to congratulate the NCI for putting efforts into it, because it's certainly an area that we need to do whatever we can to take advantage of all the wonderful discoveries that we have made and move them into something that can benefit patients.
Yeah, I mean, sort of everything that we do in cancer that's successful comes about as the result of a clinical trial. So, it's an area we have to continue to do well. Yeah. I mean, some people do say that, industry spends a lot, pharmaceutical companies spend a lot on clinical trials, which is true, but there's certain kinds of clinical trials that pharmaceutical companies don't do. And so the NCI has to, step into the breach and address those questions. So I have another question here. This is, will you be able to make progress on big data this fiscal year? Are the big data efforts in jeopardy? The answer is definitely not. So big data is a key focus area for the NCI presently. It's one of these things where we're really devoting significant attention to how we use data more efficiently and in a better way for cancer researchers. I mentioned efforts, along these lines in pediatric cancer, but I think this is not just childhood cancer. This is across the NCI, how we will use data as efficiently. And really, we have one very successful example of big data, which is the Cancer Genomic Data Commons. So the Cancer Genome Atlas led to the GDC, the Genomic Data Commons, which is this data set that the NCI supplies that has, hundreds of thousands of unique users every year. It's downloaded constantly. It's been used for thousands of papers to really advance cancer science. And it really shows you what a successful big data effort looks like. The problem is we need to have similar efforts for other kinds of cancer data, like clinical trials data, radiology data, histology data. And so we're committed to this Cancer Research Data Commons framework, where we have these nodes of data with a metadata aggregator that overlays them all, and then allows for analysis of these data sets in the cloud, using the cloud computing, for example. Building that structure is difficult. It requires significant funding. This has been supported considerably by the NCI general appropriation, and is something we're not cutting. but also the moonshot has quite a lot of funding for big data in it. So one of the Blue Ribbon panel priorities was the data ecosystem. And so we're using a considerable amount of moonshot funding to really modernize the data infrastructure.
Ned,
So
just to follow up, Liz, go.
I was going to follow up. So I think one area that all of the cancer centers realize is that the number of individuals trained to be able to deal with this data, so computational biologists we don't have enough people yet in the field, and we need to figure out how do we cross-train on biology and computational biology. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is the NCI doing anything to help?
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, I've traveled considerably since starting the job, and I've probably been to, 20 some cancer centers. And I can tell you that there's no cancer center director in the country who feels like they have enough data scientists at their institution. Right. This is a clear need across the nation. We're generating these large data sets, but we don't have enough people to really help us analyze them. And so when I say that the NCI is focusing on training and workforce development, that's one of the things I mean, is that, a key focus area for us is to make sure that we're providing not just more cancer scientists, but cancer scientists with the right background. And so we have a number of ways of doing that. We have sort of training awards, Ks and Ts and Fs, these sorts of training grants that we can dedicate and to specific topics like immuno-oncology or big data. And we're doing that. We also have a bunch of joint initiatives across the NIH to do better training in the area of big data. So for example, there's a new NIH program that's bringing data scientists to the NIH to study our data. And these are people with a very, computationally rich background. So a lot of plans in the works because this is as I mentioned, a clear need where we really need to step up and help.
And Ned, just another quick question related, which is, given the progress in the big data space in the private sector, are there any thoughts how to leverage it for interactions with the NCI?
Yeah. Thank you for making that point. As you correctly state, the industry is really making a lot of progress in data analysis, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing, frankly. I mean, the good news is this expertise is being developed in these new technologies and artificial intelligence and machine learning, and we can collaborate with industry, and we certainly do through a variety of mechanisms. But it also causes a bit of a problem because there's so much demand for data scientists that a lot of these great young people are getting poached away. They're leaving cancer research to go to work for Google or Amazon or something, and that is something we're worried about. One reason that happens, frankly, is because we haven't really provided a career ladder for these scientists. They don't really apply for R01s on their own. They're middle authors on the papers. So we're trying to figure out, can we provide specific funding for data scientists so that they look like, tenure track scientists to an academic, provost or something, so they can get promoted and stay in academia. The one piece of really good news I will say is I met a young data scientist who had been a quant on Wall Street. She'd been doing data analysis for a hedge fund and was making a lot of money doing that. And I asked her why she left that well-paying job to go be a cancer scientist. And she said, because I, got tired of making money for rich people. I wanted to do something really meaningful with my life. So
it's nice.
I was impressed by her response. And I think it shows you that our problems are really meaningful, that these data scientists want to make a difference for patients. They want to bring their skills to make the lives of people better. And so that's the one, that's a good thing we have going for us, that we have really interesting problems to work on that are very meaningful for actual humans. See, maybe we have another one here. Oh, we do have another one here. So this is, can you talk about funding for lung cancer research? And how much are we spending in lung cancer research? So, it's hard to answer a question about a specific disease with a specific number, because how do you count something like a big clinical trials network that does a lot of lung cancer research, but also does leukemia research and lymphoma research? Do we say 10% of that is lung cancer, 20? So it's hard to allocate costs to something like that. Similarly, basic science. When we fund basic science grants, which is, a big proportion of the RPG pool that I mentioned. If someone makes a discovery in, say, RAS signaling, that may turn out to be very, very meaningful in lung cancer later on, but we don't really necessarily know that at the time of the discovery. And I would argue that, the progress in lung cancer bears that point out. So, you know, great new therapies in terms of immuno-oncology, ALK inhibitors, EGFR inhibitors, these targeted agents are quite active. So progress in lung cancer has been pretty good because we have we've really improved our basic science understanding of lung cancer tremendously. Now, that's not to say that we still don't have a long way to go of lung cancer. It's by far the most lethal cancer in the United States still, and we need to make a lot more progress. But we have made some progress. And as I said, I don't think these budgetary things that we're talking about today will disadvantage lung cancer research. In fact, I think the priority of the Clinical Trials Network will be good for lung cancer research. I think the putting money into the RPG pool will be good for lung cancer research. And so I hope that our investment in that area will continue, and the success and the therapeutic benefit will continue to see.
So you mentioned that sometimes discoveries that are more in the fundamental research arena can contribute to the understanding of many different cancers. Can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on how the NCI perceive the importance of fundamental research to progress in cancer therapies and cancer management?
Yeah, thank you. In fact, this reminds me to make a point that, you know, when I started at NCI, I took 6 months to go on this listening and learning tour and really distilled the advice I got about what the NCI should do into 4 key focus areas, which include, you know, prioritizing the workforce development, modernizing clinical trials, getting a handle on big data, and then a recommitment or a continued commitment to fundamental basic science, as you mentioned. I think it's important to say that the NCI needs to continue to really support basic science for this reason. You know, it is not correct to say that the NCI ever abandoned basic science. It's been a big area of focus for us forever, essentially. But there has been so much progress in certain diseases that many voices are coming to the National Cancer Institute saying, you know, stop funding that basic stuff and, you know, prioritize the disease that I'm most interested in, you know, disease-specific translational research, which is laudable and good. And we do a lot of that, and I understand why that's important. But I think that if we don't have a basic biological understanding of the cancers we're trying to treat, then clinical trials in those areas is skipping a step. We are going straight, you know, into clinical trials that have a very low chance of working, and that's not an efficient use of funds, and that's not in anybody's best interests. So in a couple of cancers, you know, where we just don't have enough good ideas, I would argue the best hope for those patients is a real commitment to basic science so that we can have new ideas, new areas, new therapeutic ways of tackling those challenges. And so that's why I think we need to continue to prioritize basic science, and we'll do so as long as I'm NCI director. There are lots of ways to support basic scientists, you know, in the fundamental sciences, but probably the best is by prioritizing the RPG pool. So this beginning discussion we had about why we need to put funds into the RPG pool is so that scientists can dream up their own bright, great, out-of-the-box, wild ideas, apply to the NCI to fund those ideas. We can look at them and prioritize the ones we think are the best, and then we can fund this investigator-initiated science, which is where the most transformative discoveries come from. I like to give one example to show how this can kind of work. So back in the 1980s, actually at Frederick National Lab here at the NCI, a young scientist named Mariana Barbacid was trying to identify oncogenes, you know, genes that cause cancer. And he found this weird fusion gene of a gene called TRK. And he didn't really understand how that worked at the time. But he sort of said, that's neat. Look, it seems to be driving cancer. That must be important. And no idea what the use of that was going to be. Now, 30 years later, with lots of elegant studies on what TRK does and how that gene works, we have this year an FDA-approved drug for TRK inhibitors that are really useful in certain kinds of adult and childhood cancer. I don't think when Dr. Barbacid started out, you know, doing that work, he thought about curing childhood cancer, but he's produced, you know, that work has led to a very meaningful therapy for patients with those diseases. So basic science is how we get cures, but it can take a long time, unfortunately.
Just following up as well on that topic. So basic science, very important, therapeutics, but what about prevention? I know that there is a lot of effort in prevention as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, it's an interesting time in cancer prevention. We funded lots of trials in the last 2 decades to look at what I call all-comers prevention, where we try and prevent cancer by there's some molecule you take, like a retinoid or selenium or aspirin. And to date, most of those studies in all-comers have been disappointing. We have yet to identify a molecule that regular healthy individuals can take to lower their risk of cancer. You know, the recommendations to lower your risk of cancer are, you know, avoid mutagens like UV sunlight and smoking, stay thin, and get your vaccines. You know, get HPV and hepatitis B vaccine, for example. But, you know, our prevention advice for all comers beyond that is still fairly limited. So while we may have some ongoing studies in that vein, an area that looks, I think, more exciting is this notion of sort of cancer interception or precision prevention, where you identify smaller populations, not all comers, but smaller populations that are at risk, at much higher risk for cancer. So, for example, heavy smokers at risk for lung cancer, or people with genetic mutations in breast cancer susceptibility genes at high risk for breast cancer. And then you try and, you know, intercept the cancer, intercede in the process in those individuals in a way that's more personalized and precise, where you know, the trials are more efficient and easier to do, and the ability to tolerate some toxicity in those populations is higher. So we're sort of moving the paradigm of prevention right now. We're also, a lot of the things that are going on at the NCI under the rubric of prevention are really things related to early detection and screening. So liquid biopsies and, you know, cool new science like that, and how to use those in a way to, you know, marry with this precision prevention efforts is an area of active research the NCI is really excited about. There's a big opportunity now at the NCI as well. The prevention division here was led very ably by Barry Kramer for many years. Dr. Kramer, after an illustrious career in federal service, has recently retired. And so we're about to seek new leadership for that position, and finding a really great leader to steer that division, which is a big investment at the NCI, will be a key challenge coming up for us. But I have no doubt there are lots of great scientists in the prevention area that we will try and convince to come to the federal service and take that on, because it will be a really important role for the NCI. Okay, so let's see. I got another one here. Since the budget crunch affairs to affect predominantly the NCI, are there thoughts on partnerships with other NIH institutes? So this question alludes to the fact that the NIH is a big federated structure of 27 NIHs, little NIHs, of which the NCI is the largest, but there's the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive Kidney, there's Heart, Lung, and Blood, there's Institute of Aging, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a good point. Many of these other institutes and centers, so-called ICs, also fund cancer research. So they will, you know, the Liver Institute will fund some interest in liver cancer. The Neurological Disorder and Stroke Institute funds some interesting grants on brain cancer, for example. So that's great. The fact that other NIHs fund things that are related to cancer research is really wonderful, and a way to support this cadre of emerging cancer scientists. To the extent possible, we coordinate activities with the other NIHs. So we will sometimes decide, for example, we want to jointly fund an area, and then multiple institutes and centers will go in on a grant mechanism together. And that allows the NCI to stretch its dollars. So, for example, I can say there's this interesting area of a topic called clonal hematopoiesis, where you know, the stem cells that make blood become damaged with aging, and that provides a risk for leukemia, but is also associated with other non-malignant diseases. So there are multiple institutes that are interested in this emerging topic. There's the National Institute of Aging, there's Blood, there's the NCI, et cetera. So we, you know, in that area, we'll likely try and coordinate our efforts so that we don't provide duplicative funding efforts, and make sure that we really stretch initiatives to the extent possible.
Ned, I'm getting questions from the faculty whether they should try to apply to other institutes now, with the idea that perhaps there can be some internal conversations that will take place to do exactly what you said, which is to leverage the strengths of both institutes. Is that an advice that you feel is reasonable, or you give us a sense of how you view it?
Yeah, so first off, as I said before, the last thing I want to do
is
dissuade any really good scientist from sending their cancer research idea to the NIH. I mean, I think that is the message we want to transmit, is we're going to try and, to the extent possible, preserve opportunities for such individuals within NCI. It's important for junior faculty to know that they can submit their grant. Usually, most grants go to the NCI or a specific institute, they go through this thing called the Center for Scientific Review, where they're scored. That's a separate NIH. And that process is distributed to the various NIHs to decide which ones will pick them up. And it is possible to have your grant considered by multiple institutes. So you can write a grant that's, say, on brain cancer, and you can ask that it be considered both by the NCI and by the NINDS. And whoever has the better pay line may have a chance of picking that grant up. And that's very important for junior scientists to know this issue of cross-listing. They can indicate that on their cover letter to the grant, but the best way to communicate with the NCI is also to try and discuss it directly with the program officer for that study section. So they can say, look, I want to make sure my grant gets seen by anybody who might be interested in funding it. Because we are very interested in having, initiatives that we, science ideas that are related to cancer get funded by other ICs to the extent possible. And they do a lot of that.
Thank you very much. I think it's a great advice, and we make sure that the scientific community, particularly the junior investigators, are aware of it, because I'm not sure that that has been messaged in a way that everybody is aware of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the thing to reiterate, making clear though, is that these low pay lines, this competition is definitely uncomfortable for scientists. I have lived that. I have mentored junior faculty. I know how frustrating the grant process can be, but it is a competitive process for a reason, because it allows us to find and fund the best science. And competitive science is good for science, and good science is good for patients. So this influx of new ideas, sometimes we those of us in the extramural, in the cancer research world, kind of think of this as a problem, but it's actually really good news. It's a vibrant cancer research pipeline is good for patients. It's the mechanism whereby we'll make a difference for them. So, but we need to make sure that we don't discourage anybody. We need to keep those good ideas coming.
I just wanted to point out too that the NCI program staff are always willing to talk with scientists about potential grants that they're submitting, or even the reviews they got to help them make it better. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I know there's a lot of resources within the NCI to really help people do a better job with their grants.
Yeah, thank you for making that point, Liz. I think the particularly junior scientists are a little worried about contacting the NCI. Like
exactly.
They're scared they might, say the wrong thing or something. But the answer is that we have program staff whose job is to speak with potential fundees. They will always get back to request information about their funding. It can be a little complicated finding the right person to speak to. So there's this difference between a program officer and a program director, and it may happen that if you send your email to one person, they may ask a colleague to talk to you. That's appropriate to make sure that we have the right person conveying information. But someone will be eager to talk to you and provide advice and feedback. I generally recommend you try and talk to these people over the phone. Email is not necessarily the best for some of these nuanced conversations. So the people that work for me are eager to help fundees and eager to speak to them by phone if needed, to make sure that we really are clear in why and how they, what's the best path forward to seek future funding.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, I have another question here. So let's see. What do you see is the role of the NCI designated cancer moving forward? And could you elaborate on the funding strategy for NCI centers? So the cancer centers are a really important part of the National Cancer Institute. I believed this when I was a cancer center director myself, but having come to NCI, I've become convinced that they're even more important. And I can argue why. They provide the NCI with extramural advice all over the country about what's going on in cancer, and they are really good spokespeople for cancer research, and they provide this integrated care for patients that's really great. But one thing that has become very obvious to me as NCI director, they're also a very good bargain for the NCI. For every dollar of money we provide to a cancer center, they raise tremendous funds for cancer research at their institution. They do this through state money, through other philanthropy, through foundations. So they are really good at taking the small amount of funds in some instances that we provide to them and leveraging it for a much greater support from other areas. And this is leveraging. This is how the NCI dollars can really advance cancer science in a very positive way. And I think, by the way, the cancer centers may have something to do with this influx of new initiatives. I remember when I was an academic, many people wanted to join my cancer center because of the great infrastructure we had. They wanted access to our cores and our administrative help writing grants. And we would love to have people come to the cancer center as long as they were writing grants in cancer. So I think the cancer centers provide a way of steering junior scientists into cancer science, which is really good for our field. So they're a good investment. They're an important part of our program. They were created by the National Cancer Act in the 1970s, and that federal imprimatur of NCI designation has really become highly competitive. So if we have 70 NCI designated cancer centers, but there are many more cancer hospitals in the country that would like NCI designation. And how we can grow that program is a topic of constant conversation. But I will say, so as I mentioned, those cuts that I talked about is continuing, non-competing grants are not being extended to the cancer centers. And I'd like to say a word about that. So we don't want to cut cancer centers because, as I mentioned, they're a very good investment. But the other reason is that we spent several years at the NCI. This is a process that Dr. Varmus, Harold Varmus, started when he was NCI director, to really think about the funding model for the cancer centers and to make sure it was fair and equitable. And so some centers had a lot more funding relative to their size than others. It wasn't quite uniform in terms of quality of science at each institution. So the Cancer Center program went through a very rigorous reevaluation and came up with a new funding model that we all agree is more fair and is a better way to fund the cancer centers. And we have started instituting that model about a year ago. Actually, really sort of started it for 2 years ago, but the main part of the implementation started about a year ago. And the way it's being implemented is that when a cancer center comes up for new funding every 5 years, then we, as we renew its grant, we apply the new funding model. And most places are seeing an increase in their budget that's modest. The problem is we're 1 year into that process, and only 20% of cancer centers have gone through it. And it wouldn't be fair now in the middle to change and say we're going to go back to the old model for the other 80% of cancer centers. So we thought we would have to let that process play out to get the cancer center funding where we want it to be. And so that's in 2019. I have to say, though, that all the conversation we're having today is really about 2019. I'm not sure what will happen to some of these mechanisms in 2020. It depends on the appropriation from Congress. But I'd like to prioritize the cancer centers to the extent possible, because they're a big part of our success, I think. Okay, it looks like that's moving to a close now. I'd like to thank everyone for doing this. This has been a lot of fun, a live Facebook event, a Twitter event, a new thing for NCI. I'd like to thank Liz and Daphne particularly. You're really providing your insights. This is shows, I think, the great support that the NCI has from the extramural community. And I'd like to thank them both as researchers and what they do for patients with cancer. I think they are a shining example of the quality of high cancer research going on in the United States at these various institutions, and great partners for the NCI. So thanks a lot, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ned.
U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, cancer.gov, 1-800-4CANCER. Produced January 2019.